Hey geeks! The news about Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito's opinion on Roe v. Wade has literally been front page news around the world. And that's because we're a country that works to promote democracy and civil rights globally. So we kind of look like hypocrites when our justices lie to our faces and walk back women's reproductive rights. In his draft opinion, Justice Alito wrote, "It is time to heed the Constitution and return the issue of abortion to the people's elective representatives." If there's any debate as to whether we heed the Constitution, you need look no further than guns, which have less regulations than women's bodies. Since clearly the conservative justices of the Supreme Court would like to live in 1787, I say we just send these justices back in time so that they can get the extra dose of testosterone they're looking for. Congressman Madison Cawthorn can lead the trip. We got a lot going on today. I'm going to give you the latest in Ukraine. We'll talk about a US-Russia prisoner swap, El Salvador's crackdown on gangs, Iran pursuing assassinations in the United States. Hello? And we're going to shine a spotlight on Americans who are helping Ukraine in some really cool ways. Before we start though, please show me some love by hitting that subscribe button below, click the notification bell, and like this video. The US and Europe have ramped up their efforts to support Ukraine, which is great, but it's also escalated tensions between us and Russia even further. Western leaders and officials have been visiting Ukraine's capital, Kiev, to show their support, but the Secret Service won't let President Biden visit since they worry Russia could bombard the capital while he's there. So they send Secretary of State Blinken and Secretary of Defense Austin instead, because apparently they're replaceable. Just kidding. While he was there, Secretary Austin said that we want to see Russia weaken to the point where it can't do things like invade Ukraine. And immediately after that trip, Biden asked Congress to approve a huge $33 billion aid package to Ukraine, which includes $20 billion in military aid. As someone who's on the inside, let me tell you, the US would not give that much support at this point in time if they didn't think Ukraine was on the verge of winning. Many other NATO countries have also increased arms shipments to Ukraine, and just this week, we learned that the EU is preparing to sanction Russian oil imports, which is huge because the EU sends $450 million a day to Russia for oil purchases. So targeting that robs Russia of billions of dollars that could be used to finance its war machine. Now, Russia will sell some of its oil to countries like China and India, but it still can't make up for a loss that big so quickly. Given all these efforts, and particularly because of how much the West is supporting Ukraine with weapons, Russia's talk of nuclear war has increased. Russia has repeatedly made nuclear threats since invading Ukraine, and now their foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, warned that the risk of nuclear war is now, quote, considerable. So are they bluffing? It's hard to say. The Russian government does talk a big game, but they're not known for bluffing a lot. That doesn't mean New York City is going to be blown up the way these dumb Russian TV hosts joked, but it does mean that the Russian government considers its nuclear weapons as part of its strategy. So they're going to dangle that threat to get us to stop sending arms, or they could use those weapons in Ukraine itself. Luckily, the US has hundreds of satellites and spacecraft that monitor Russia's nuclear forces, so we're watching closely. Bottom line is I don't think nuclear war is around the corner, but we also haven't talked this much about it since the end of the Cold War. All this points to one critical piece left to our policy in Ukraine, and that's that all wars end in peace negotiations. So as Russia swings around its nuclear weapons, like a teenage boy, our next focus has to be to try to round up a whole big bunch of countries and bring them all to the table for some really uncomfortable conversations to help stop Russia's atrocities in their track and reach a peace deal as quickly as possible. Even in time of war, the US and Russia are able to negotiate, which we saw this week with the announcement of a prisoner swap. A former US Marine named Trevor Reed was detained in Russia in 2019 when he was visiting Moscow with his girlfriend. He was arrested for public intoxication and convicted because the Russians claimed he allegedly posed a threat to security guards, but it's clear he was detained to give Russia diplomatic leverage. Now, after months of negotiations, Reed was released in exchange for a Russian prisoner we were holding named Konstantin Yaroshenko. That guy was a Russian pilot who was arrested in Libya and extradited here after being charged for conspiracy to bring drugs into the United States. Kind of like the premier of the British Virgin Islands, who was just arrested in Miami this week in a DEA sting for trying to smuggle thousands of kilos of cocaine into the US. We'll talk about that another time. So in a scene out of a Hollywood movie, American and Russian planes land on a tarmac at a Turkish airport and the prisoners were swapped. And this is great news for the Reed family. And I think our government should do what it can to get Americans who are wrongfully rotting in jails abroad released. Which leads me to the stories of two other American political prisoners in Russia. Another former US Marine named Paul Whelan was detained at a hotel in Moscow in 2018. He was in Russia for a friend's wedding and was accused of espionage and sentenced to 16 years of hard labor. And right before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, WNBA star Brittany Griner was also detained at a Moscow airport after allegedly being accused of carrying cannabis oil. We don't know exactly why Trevor Reed was released and not the others, except that his release might have been prioritized because his health is in really bad shape. Whatever the situation, we gotta try to get the other remaining American prisoners out as quickly as possible before Russia tries to use them as expensive bargaining chips related to the Ukraine war. A About a month ago, El Salvador suffered a major spike in homicides when gang members were blamed for 62 killings in a single weekend. The president there, who's a young, slightly authoritarian guy named Nayib Bukele, imposed a state of emergency that resulted in the arrest of over 22,000 presumed gang members, and now several organizations say the government is stepping on civil liberties and people's human rights. But the vast majority of Salvadoran citizens support his efforts. So what's the deal? El Salvador has a really high rate of violent crime perpetrated by a number of gangs, but in particular one you may have heard of called MS-13. This gang literally controls and runs parts of the country, and it brutally abuses and represses the people living in those areas. So when this president came to office in 2019, his goal was to stop the gang violence, and at first crime did go down, which the US government says was because of a secret truce Bukele struck with these gang members, but he denies a deal ever happened. Whatever did happen, violence basically blew up overnight, so Bukele enacted a state of emergency that allowed people to be arrested and held without charges. He also lengthened sentences for gang members and allowed kids as young as 12 to be tried as adults. So human rights groups are now criticizing the measures, saying they've been arbitrary detentions of innocent people and that a couple people arrested have died while in custody. And the US has called on the Salvadoran government to, quote, uphold due process and protect civil liberties. But Bukele doesn't care. In fact, he shares photos of handcuffed and bloodied gang members on social media all the time and has criticized human rights groups for lashing out at him. He admits that some innocent people were wrongfully arrested, but says it's the minority. Most importantly, what do Salvadoran citizens say? Well, most of them say they support Bukele's moves if it means he puts an end to this violence and crime once and for all. I think it's important to put ourselves in the shoes of a Salvadoran citizen. Gangs in El Salvador control swaths of territory through brutality and fear. Citizens have shared stories about how they and their families have been terrorized and repressed, how they've had relatives killed or tortured for no reason, and how they've had to give up a portion of their income to these gangs. Kind of sounds like ISIS when it controlled parts of Iraq and Syria. And this is what has driven thousands from the country to travel more than 1,000 miles to the American border. A recent poll found that 91% of Salvadorans surveyed support Bukele's latest measures to crack down on these gangs, even if it comes at the expense of their democracy. They say that if they have to choose between authoritarianism imposed by these gangs or by the government, they'd rather have the government. My hope is that Bukele gets things under control and puts El Salvador's democracy back on track so that Salvadorans don't ever have to make this choice again. So I gotta share this story with you because it's insane, but it's true. The State Department submitted a report to Congress that said it was spending over $2 million a month to provide round-the-clock protection to former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and one of his top former aides, Brian Hook. State has spent over $13 million in this effort to date. Sounds crazy? Maybe not. All former secretaries of state automatically receive protection for 6 months after leaving office. But in a congressional hearing that just took place, Secretary of State Blinken explained that he continues to renew that security for these guys because of an ongoing threat against American officials, both present and past. Turns out that as the architect of Trump's maximum pressure campaign against Iran, the Iranian government continues to pursue real and ongoing attempts to assassinate Mike Pompeo. Don't worry though, because Senator Ted Cruz from Texas offered a creative solution when he asked Blinken whether the Biden administration was requiring Iran to pledge not to murder a former Secretary of State. Yeah, they pinky swore and then they all took a shot at tequila together. It sounds ridiculous, but the fact is that the Iranian government has previously pursued assassination or kidnapping attempts on American soil because they believe they live in a Mission Impossible movie. While this is all happening, Iran is demanding that the US remove its terrorist designation of its paramilitary wing, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Luckily, it looks like Biden is intent on keeping that designation in place. And I'm going to do the same, which is why Iran's government and its revolutionary thugs are on my list this week. These Americans are doing some really cool things to help Ukrainians in innovative ways. The first is Blake Resnick, who's a 22-year-old who founded a drone company called Brink Drone, which has provided $150,000 worth of drones and equipment to Ukraine. These aren't just any drones. They fly where humans can't, and they support rescue missions by finding victims in bombed-out high-rises and apartment buildings, and they can also be used to spy on enemy forces. Blake Resnick actually created this drone after the 2017 shooting at the Mandalay Bay Hotel in Las Vegas, because he wanted to create a device that SWAT teams could use to reach shooters and hostages in dangerous situations. Isn't that amazing? The second is Jeff Prahl, who's 28 years old from Maryland and who flew to Ukraine at the beginning of the war when President Zelensky called on everyone to come and help. He didn't want to use a gun though, so he went to Lviv and founded an animal shelter called the Home of Rescued Animals that takes care of animals that have been orphaned or abandoned, and he helps them get adopted. Sometimes there are as many as 36 dogs at the shelter, so that's no small feat. Finally is my sister from another Mr. Marian Cholnoki-K and her sister Elizabeth Cholnoki, who traveled to Hungary to give direct support and aid to Ukrainian refugees. Their parents were Hungarian refugees who left Hungary during World War II, and given how much they benefited from the support of aid organizations and the kindness of strangers, these two sisters decided they wanted to give back. So they went to Hungary in coordination with the Hungarian Human Rights Foundation to help Ukrainian refugees out. To support or learn more about these efforts, visit the Hungarian Human Rights Foundation, the home of rescued animals, and Brink Drone. Thanks, Geeks! I know I missed you last week. I was actually in Sicily hiking a volcano called Mount Etna. See, that's me there, hiking that monster while it's apparently spewing lava. Before you go, please like this video, click the subscribe button and the notification bell. And if you have something you want me to talk about, reach out to me over social media and I will definitely give you a shout out. Stay fabulous, Geeks.